Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 1 of this new series on understanding our own invisible future edge. I'm so delighted to be back with something new. For the last several years, actually, we've been working on consulting projects with organizations to understand how to create more future ready organizations. And the past year and a half, we've been engaged in some fairly deep research around what is it that creates the right psychology for the future. Because one of the things we've realized time and again is that it isn't because senior leaders, don't have the resources to see the future, and it certainly isn't because they aren't smart. But there is a certain, there is a very definite set of psychological factors that allows them to see the future as it's emerging and create a response to it. So in today's episode, I'm going to speak about one such phenomenon, and that's the conformity trap. Now, the conformity trap is actually really interesting for me because I was first introduced to it about 20 years ago when I was doing my PhD. And for me, it was really interesting to discover, and we all know it, that when our friends say something, we tend to agree with them in public, whether or not we agree with them in private. But what this set up for me was this enormous realization that this plays out even when we meet people who are complete strangers. So I'm going to walk you through a little bit about the research behind our desire to conform, and then speak a little bit about how this plays out at the level of senior leaders and what that means for organizations and their future readiness. And then I have a special guest who's going to speak about what she has observed in the many rooms that she has been a part of where future ready discussions happen, and how she sees some of this play out in real organizational settings. So with that, let's get started. For the very first time for me, I actually have a few slides to show you. And those slides were important for this episode because I wanted to show you some of how the experiment that actually got this conversation started was actually set up. So I'm just going to bring on a few slides. Again, as I said, really the first time for me. So what we're going to speak about today is the conformity trap. And the conformity trap is about how our desire for belonging sometimes interferes in our actual capacity to see the future coming. The study that I spoke about is actually not a new study. It dates back to the 1950s. A professor called Solomon Asch had set up an experiment where he invited college students to really do something very simple. Match the line on the left with the lines on the right. So you would imagine that nobody can really go very wrong in this. The answers were set up in a way that the clear answer was, frankly, absolutely obvious. But in a twist to this experiment, what he did was he had, instead of asking the individual to answer this question all by themselves, he had invited actors into the room. And the actors gave their answer before the individual who was called into the room was asked what they thought of it. And what he discovered was really, really interesting, and in some way frames our conversation today. About 75% of the over 150 people who participated in this experiment landed up giving a public answer that they knew was incorrect, simply because people before them had expressed that was the right answer. So if everybody says A is the right answer, and I know that actually it's C, just because everybody else says A, I say A. So that was the finding from this study. Now, what this means for us is that the desire to conform with what the popular opinion around us is absolutely hard-grained, and it isn't really hard to understand why. Our evolutionary history has favored individuals who are part of a tribe and who can play along with whatever it is that the tribe wants to do. This, however, starts to have some very interesting consequences when we move into times like today, when there is so much change. Let's add another layer to this. This experiment was really set up in a context where the actor entering the room, didn't know any of the people in the room, and really wasn't going to ever meet them again. So you might think, like, what are the stakes here? It's just a random question. Why would this situation create the dynamic that would make people answer, go along with the public opinion, even if they privately held a different answer? Now, think about what happens when we bring the same phenomenon into organizations. Organizations have groups of people who've been working together for a while, sometimes a very, very long while. And when you join an organization, very often part of the psychological contract you have with the organization is that you will see questions and problems through the dominant or the frame of reference that the organization themselves hold. And that's sort of part of the unsaid, psychological contract, you can call it fitting into the organization, you can call it going along with the culture of the organization. But over years of being part of that, it creates challenges for senior leaders' own capacity to be, notice some of the signals that were not part of this frame. So what happens is that when things start emerging that are outside this frame of reference, that they have either consciously or without necessarily being conscious of it, sort of imbibed as their very own lens for viewing problems and the world, weak signals, and weak signals are signals of trends that are just emerging in the world, often get unnoticed because they lie outside the frame. Not only do weak signals get unnoticed, even if as an individual leader I were to notice them, it becomes hard to bring them into a conversation where they don't very readily fit into the frame of conversations, discussions, or the way problems are generally looked at. And over time, our capacity as senior leaders, in fact, starts narrowing in our ability to see these weak signals that are outside this frame of reference and begin to notice what's changing before it becomes really, really loud. So this creates a challenge for leaders. It actually creates a challenge for everyone, but this challenge really intensifies for leaders and brings us to the question that what does this mean for us as people working in organizations and working on our own future readiness? The reason I brought in the evolutionary aspect of this was to remind us all that this is so hardwired that it isn't very easy to step out of. We have been, from an evolutionary perspective, selected because we have, encoded within us the capacity to see something the way our group sees it. So the art of seeing something that's different from the way the group sees it is something that we would need to bring in as an additional skill, capability, or perhaps as a starting point, a consciousness that this is important. Now, with me to discuss what this looks like in real world situations, I'm going to bring on Deepika Deshpande. Deepika happens to be a classmate of mine from IM, but beyond that, she's had a really, really successful career at very high and senior leadership levels at Citibank. And after that, she's now the COO of a Singapore-based fintech organization. She also is a PhD herself from Singapore Management University. Hi, Deepika.
Hi, Shalini. Lovely to chat with you, and what a wonderful introduction.
No, I'm so happy to have you here, Deepika. I mean, I couldn't think of anyone better than you to discuss what this actually means, both within larger organizations and some of the newer organizations that you've been part of. And I'd love to hear from you your own experience of, how have you observed this desire for conformity play out in both contexts? Would love to know
Yeah.
more.
So let me begin by saying that this is a very relevant topic because we live in times of great disruption. And I'm going to begin with a simple observation, and I think you referenced it at the beginning, which is that organizations rarely miss the future because they lack intelligence. People are very smart. It's usually how they interpret the signals and how they react to them. So let's consider the very famous example of Kodak. They saw the future before arguably anyone else did. They, in fact, invented the digital camera. But that future was way too disruptive. It didn't conform to their profit model, their business model, and so they put it away until it was very late, and then the rest is history. So I'm going to come back to your question on how decisions regarding the future play out in large organizations and small organizations, and it is very different. Smaller organizations have fewer layers, they don't have committees, they have fewer filters between the signal and the action. When there's a change in the market, the usual response is, let's try and do something different. Right? These organizations are optimized for adaptation. They're not looking for clarity before they move, because learning happens in motion. Now, if you contrast that with a large organization, they are optimized for something different. They are optimized for continuity. So when they are faced with a big change, they are going to react very differently. They have governance structures and risk frameworks, stakeholders, quarterly meetings. So when there's a market signal change, they don't jump to a reaction. They probably will have a meeting, build a model, scenario plan, risk assessment. So it's very different, and it's really an attribute of scale and to preserve what they already have built.
Yeah, I can truly see that. Deepika, have you seen the dynamics in large organizations impact the ability to even recognize signals in the first place?
So, since we are talking about large and small organizations primarily from the lens of conformity, because that's one of the very big differences between them, right? So, I just want to clarify that, in my view, it would be simplistic to view conformity necessarily as an impediment to being future ready.
Yeah.
It has a more nuanced role. Conformity in large organizations can be inherently very valuable and play a certain function. It provides stability, it prevents chaos, it helps align behavior in a complex
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
organization with many functions. And
yeah.
without some degree of conformity, the organization would just disintegrate
Perhaps.
into a pile of dysfunction. But on the other hand, it also filters ideas, and past successes create identity. And identity narrows attention, and dissent carries reputational risk. So, what happens is that signals can get dismissed. Contrary data that is contradictory may get softened. If ideas are too radical, they may get reworded so that they are a little less radical. I mean, nobody explicitly says don't challenge the model or the
Yeah.
current model, but everybody understands that there is a lot to protect, stuff that has been built over time. Uh, so it's simply understood. So what happens is that conformity can sometimes very quietly impact future readiness. It may not be as obvious, but it can have a subtle impact because there's a tendency to cling and protect what has already been built.
No, I truly see that. Deepika, what would you say are some things that then people in senior leadership roles can do to sort of counter this very, very natural and understandable, uh, need to protect, as you said, what has already been built, uh, and not necessarily like reject what is, but be able to bring in new ideas that are different, because in a world where so much is changing, uh, our ability to be successful rests not just on what has worked in the past, but our capacity to see what's emerging before it's almost like screaming at us.
Absolutely, and that's so true. So we briefly talked about the Kodak example in the beginning. So what I would say is the real question to focus on is probably not can the organization see the future, because the organization is full of smart people who almost certainly read a lot, they interact with the market, they certainly can see the future. Uh, the question probably can be rephrased as, does the organization have the culture and the capacity to respond before certainty arrives? In other words, to act before, so the change already becomes a part of the BAU in the market, right? In that sense, future readiness is, to a great extent, cultural. I mean, it's probably about sense making in the face of ambiguity. It is easy to make sense when there's clarity, because you can separate things out into neat boxes and categories. But sense making in the face of ambiguity can be quite challenging. You need to be prepared to change your view because things may change in real time. Wayfinding can be very different, because wayfinding should have, or should give some room for experimentation, perhaps even failure, small failures, so that you can find your path around uncertainty. um, Inner grounding, I think you referenced that as well. Inner grounding is very important, because without that you would never be able to tolerate diversity of opinion, sometimes perhaps even some level of dissent, because ideas can truly differ. And then finally, a self-awareness for that hidden bias, the tendency to hold on to what is there. And that's, whether you call it a shadow force or you call it a unconscious bias, whatever it is, but that does really exist. So what happens is that when conformity becomes too tight, the organization is excellent at refining yesterday. So they'll play that game very well, but they'd be very hesitant to reinvent tomorrow, because that really requires a departure from the past. Uh, so, in my view, the leadership challenge in larger organizations is not so much to eliminate conformity, but just loosen it enough so that divergence can breathe and the organization can probably become a little bit more adaptable.
Oh, I love that. I love the way you worded it. Loosen conformity so that the organization can be more adaptive and new ideas can come in. So tell me, Deepika, at an individual level, I mean, so there are two conversations. One is what happens in an organizational level, and we've spoken a lot about the organizational framework that creates the almost unspoken need to see things through a certain lens or a certain frame. Uh, but what do you think an individual leader can do in their own personal capacity to both create the capacity for um, spotting new ideas and to bring them into the organizations that they're part of?
I mean, there probably isn't one psychological characteristic. There's probably a cluster of them that are required. But if there is one that is probably that probably stands out, it is the willingness to accommodate some level of difference. Whether it be building a team of different kind of people, we usually like to have people around us who are similar to us, part of the tribe. I think you mentioned that, right?
Homophily. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. It's easier to work with people who think like us, have the same work habits. And of course, work habits are important. Nobody wants laggards, but to be able to work with different kinds of people, to manage dissent, and to allow the right kind of questioning that creates a feeling of psychological safety, so that people can speak up, try ideas within pragmatic limits. I think probably that may be the most important characteristic.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And certainly in a leadership role, that makes a lot of sense. One last question, I know, Deepika. What do you think someone can do beyond their leadership capacity, but to improve their own personal ability to see what's different? So, one is creating that environment within their own teams, but just creating the ability or capacity within yourself, because we do know through research people vary a great deal in their
Yeah, yeah.
inclination to view things that in the same frame, or inclination to do the opposite, I would say, and everywhere in
Exactly,
between.
exactly, exactly.
How
Uh,
much of a challenger do I want to be? How much of a conformist do I want to be? And how
right,
much of everything, every shade in between?
right, right. I mean, see, we all have our natural personality types. Some of us, like to argue. put our thoughts forward more forcefully. Others are, wait for consensus to emerge. So those are sort of personal traits. But in terms of sort of being future ready, I would say if there's one trait at an individual level we can adopt, it is the habit of learning, being curious and continuously learning, so that you get exposed to things that are changing. And I think people who learn, who talk to people who are dissimilar, read widely, they would naturally be more comfortable with things that are sort of different. They're willing to change their mind because they've experienced it. I mean, I can tell you, Shalini, when it comes to reading, particularly, I would say the best books that I have read are those books which, after you put them away, you found, oh, that book made me change my mind. It's wonderful to be caught wrong footed. I had a different idea. I was so wrong. Now I'm at the right place. So, just the willingness to learn keeps an open mind and sort of keeps you in touch with what's happening. So I would say at an individual level, I'm going to place that as probably the foremost.
The most important. Thank you so much, Deepika, for joining us. I really, really appreciate it. I mean, I
Thank you,
love the
Shalini.
ideas that you shared here. Both the fact that alignment is actually can be quite positive in large organizations, but that alignment needs to be held with spaces for change. I think that's what you spoke about.
Yeah.
So, how do we create those environments where there is space for change, space for new ideas to come in, and also create space where you know we ourselves can keep learning and growing. I liked your
Exactly.
ideas about books as a source of new learning and perhaps thinking in different ways. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you, Shalini.
So I loved what Deepika said, and I'm going to bring what Deepika said along with some of the things that we found through research. Deepika spoke about how organizations almost necessarily have to have a frame, and that frame brings in alignment. And we know that through research that when an individual joins an organization, they tacitly or consciously adopt that frame, at least for the period that they're in the frame. If you're ever wondering what that frame might be, look at different organizations which are operating in the same industry, in the same business environment, and you might see that these different organizations are actually viewing the same set of problems a little bit differently. Uh, that difference comes from the frame that they have adopted. Uh, Sometimes, particularly when organizations are very successful, they hold on to that frame very, very strongly because that's what's brought in past success. And yet, when we're working or operating in a world that's changing so fast, the challenge is that anything outside that frame uh, is harder and harder to notice the stronger the frame is held. So, what it means for leaders is to be very conscious of the fact that they might be missing out on weak signals in the environment. And weak signals are those signals that, in the early stages, just give you a hint of what might unfold in the future, but haven't as yet become full blown mainstream trends. The other piece is what is it that we need to do individually? And Deepika spoke about learning and learning as a source of new ideas. Let me add a few more ideas to that. For us to be a senior leader, or in fact, even be a successful professional, it's helpful to notice when our desire for conformity is at play. Now, it's a little hard, but just think about it. When you're in a meeting and you know that you've seen something that's quite different from what's being discussed in the meeting, how comfortable are you at bringing that into the conversation? And what are your skills in bringing that into the conversation? It also means speaking to people who are different, who hold ideas that are different from the ones that are part of, just the organizational way of looking at the world. Uh, it means reading much more broadly. It means sometimes being very alive to what are the gaps that are being seen by entrepreneurs within that industry, because entrepreneurship rests on the capacity to see weak and emerging signals and use that as possible business opportunities. So there's a lot of work that each one of us has to do to make sure that our desire for conformity, which is ingrained into us from an evolutionary perspective, does not interfere in our capacity to be future ready, allowing us to see things that are emerging, things that can be tomorrow, and then finding our own way to bring creative solutions for this. So I hope you enjoyed today's conversation. If you want to participate in more discussions around the psychology of future readiness, join us for future sessions. Thank you.